Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Yes, now? Okay. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you with us. This is the first virtual public event that the Scholl Chair has done, and I'm really looking forward to it because we've got two, I think, exceptionally interesting guests to talk. And we're going to focus on supply chains, which those of you that follow other Scholl Chair work know has been one of our themes. Everybody's talking about supply chains, and I thought we would drill down and be a little bit more specific and look at one particular sector and ask our guests to focus on that sector, which in our case is the fashion sector, really apparel, and to talk about what's been happening in that industry and where they see things going. We have, when this all began, when the pandemic began, a lot of the conversation was about how soon do we get back to normal? How soon can we restore status quo ante? And I think now people are beginning to realize that we probably are not going to get back to the old normal. There's going to be a new normal. And a lot of what we're doing at CSIS is trying to figure out what that's going to be, both in general and specifically. And the apparel industry, which is one that is truly global and has had for a long time international supply chains, is one that has been impacted both by the pandemic, impacted by other trends that were underway before that. And one of the things I'm going to ask our guests is to talk about whether the changes that are occurring in this industry are continuations and accelerations of things that were happening anyway, or if there are new things that COVID-19 is bringing on. And then, sadly, we also have the current situation in the United States and the protests that are going on. And I'm going to ask them if they want to reflect on how that has impacted the industry as well. I'm going to introduce our guests in a minute, and then they're each going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'm going to have a conversation with them. And then we're going to turn it over to all of you to ask questions. Some of you have submitted questions in advance. If you have not and you want to submit one, there's a button on our event page on the CSIS website through which you can submit questions live, and they'll be channeled to me, and I will then ask them. So please do that as questions occur to you, and we plan to keep this within an hour, so we'll get in as many questions as we can. I'm particularly pleased to have guests that I think are exceptionally well qualified to talk about this. Our first is Steve Lamar, who is the president and CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association, who has a long career in this industry. Steve and I have known each other probably for longer than either one of us wants to admit, and he's a real professional in the association business and knows this particular industry backwards and forwards. Joining him is Colin Brown, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Under Armour, prior to which he was their Chief Supply Chain Officer and President of Global Sourcing. So he has a strong background not only in this industry, but in the supply chain and sourcing end of it in particular. So we have two experts, and they're going to each make some comments of their own, and then we're going to follow up on some of the issues that I raised in my introduction. So Steve, let's start with you.
Great, thanks, Bill, and thanks for I think also mentioning the protests. Our country is going through a lot of challenges right now, and there's there's a lot that we're going to have to do, I think, to repair them. We and many of our members have been making statements about them to share our frustrations, to express our support for the peaceful protests, and to offer our assistance in the road ahead. So that's clearly going to be part of our conversation going forward, and we'll definitely be part of that. Just to give a little bit of introduction about the American Apparel and Footwear Association, trade association representing the full spectrum of the fashion industry: apparel, footwear, travel goods, accessories. We've got members that are retailers, wholesalers, manufacturers, suppliers, importers, exporters. Under Armour, of course, is a member, and Colin Brown is our chair. We like to say that we make everywhere and we sell everywhere. Our fashion is a global business, and our members are there with it to make sure that the people of the world are fashionably dressed. Bill, you asked us to share kind of using, I think, that supply chain and trade lens, kind of what's different and what's the same. So, there's no question the world has changed. We're going to be into a new normal. Change is really nothing new for the fashion industry, but I think the pace at which change is going to be occurring or has occurred probably is something new for us, as it is for many others. So before we talk about what some of that new stuff might look like, let me also share kind of what's going to be the same, or where we still think a lot of the same is going to happen. First and foremost is tariffs. Not a lot of people realize this, but we pay an awful lot of tariffs. In the first 3 months of this year, our industry paid about $4.5 billion worth of tariffs. That's a lot of money, and that's money that isn't able to be used for, in the last couple of months for liquidity to help manage the COVID crisis, but under normal times for innovation, for job growth, and so forth. It's money that goes to the federal government. Global, as I mentioned before, this is a global industry, and this will continue to be a global industry. 98% of what we consume is made offshore, and 96% of our customers live offshore. We like to say, if you want to be successful in this industry, you have to have access to global suppliers and access to global customers. And then lastly is China. China continues to be a major supplier and a major market. And while both of those will change as companies diversify their sourcing out of China, and while they continue to grow their marketing presence into China, there is no question that China will remain hugely important for our industry. So let me just talk about a couple of things that we think are going to be different. And the first is going to sound like I'm contradicting what I just said, and that's diversification. The trade war, which we were experiencing for the last couple of years, that has been incentivizing companies to move production of their finished products out of China. What COVID has been doing, and some of the other policy issues that we're encountering in China, of course, with the situation with the Uyghurs, the forced labor problems that we've condemned, that's reinforcing that move out of China for supply chains, but not just for finished products, but now also for your level 2, your level 3 suppliers. Now we're seeing the election year rhetoric, and that is certainly encouraging people to kind of continue that diversification if the U.S.-China relationship continues to go through some challenges. Related to that point, for supply chains in general, companies are looking to be more regional and vertical as they kind of reconstruct or reimagine their supply chains going forward. There's a couple of things going on here. They want to reduce their exposure to multiple countries, but they also want to help make sure their supply chains are pivoting so they can be faster to service, increasingly impatient consumers. Again, there's nothing new there. To service e-commerce, there's nothing new there, and speed to market. But over the last couple of months, we've seen more acceleration towards those areas. So if your supply chain is closer to your consumer, and if you're more nimble, you can take advantage of not only those evolving trends to react to consumers, but then if there's a problem, you will be in a better situation so you can manage those problems that may exist. And the last is sustainability. This has long been something that we've been talking about. 2020 was going to be the year when it's no longer really about whether your marketing is authentic or not, but whether or not sustainability is actually in your DNA. And I think there's two things that have emerged out of the COVID crisis that we're hearing about that members are reacting to, and they're hearing as well. One is that we've really been training our consumers over the last 90 days to get by with less. Now there's certainly going to be an unleashing of demand. I think when we're able to get back into the stores, we are, of course, social creatures. I think people are looking forward to getting back into the stores and to be buying more product. And I think that will be product that is not just for the below the keyboard fashions, but I think we're going to be seeing a lot of opportunities. But have consumers learned the lesson that they don't need as many clothes, they don't need as many shoes as they've needed in the past? And that's been a conversation in the apparel and footwear industry for a number of years is as companies are moving towards sustainability, does the underlying production model have to change? And the next thing is we've seen a lot of anecdotal information about how the last 90 days, the planet has actually improved a little bit. We've seen, less smog. You've seen stories about wildlife and everything. And I think that's giving consumers a taste of this is what could happen if we make significant radical changes to improve sustainability. I think it's going to whet their appetite that they want to see that sustainability trend, which was already well established, well in place by our members, including Under Armour. But I think they're going to see that's going to need to accelerate. I think that's going to just increase that demand as they're looking for fashions in the post-COVID world. So with that, let me turn it over to Colin and comment further.
Excellent. Colin?
Steve and I kind of follow each other around a little bit sometimes, with him being the president, me being the chairman. So occasionally when I have to follow Steve, he always says all the good bits. But I think, I'm going to echo a few of the different comments that Steve made here. And, as Bill kindly introduced me, I'm the COO of Under Armour. Under Armour, most of you will know the brand. We're a global business. We don't just sell here in the US. We sell in China and Europe, you name it. We have stores, we have retail kind of presence in most of those places. Now, just to give you some context, as we've obviously gone through this, many of our stores have closed down. We've had to furlough workers. We've gone through all of these challenges that many other companies have gone through. But we're now starting to see recovery on the back of that. So we're pretty much open in China now. China's pretty much not quite back to the normal, but it's back to a new normal, we think. We are seeing, consumer patterns change and how they start to think about buying product. And we're now starting to see that kind of opening up and that shift happening in Europe. And we're now starting to think through what that means for the US as we kind of start to open things up here in the US. We've also been dealing, with many supply chain challenges. And the supply chain, we have within businesses like ours, and many supply chains, we run something called an ES&OP, Executive Sales and Operational Planning kind of model, where we look to always balance supply and demand and make sure those two things are in sync. But obviously, we've been going through some significant challenges with demand, and we've had significant challenges with supply. So we've been, it's been a very challenging time for supply chains, and we're all very concerned, basically, of the longer term impact that that's going to have on our industry, and not just in the sports industry, but in the fashion industry as well. And obviously, just thinking through how we stand up crisis management has been a big thing that we've been kind of leaning into, making sure that we've got those right protocols in place and those right processes to help manage that. So, following on for the same theme that kind of Steve kicked us off with, was, what's the same and what's going to be different? Well, I think we're largely seeing a rapid acceleration of existing things. And I believe for a long time that, certainly from a supply chain perspective, the days of sourcing, as we used to call it, has long gone. I was one of these guys. I started work in the UK in the 1980s, working in factories, and I moved over to Asia in kind of the early 1990s. And I was one of these guys that helped move production off to Asia. And I like the expression that in those days we were marauding garmentos. We literally went from one country to another country in search of the mythical prize of the lowest FOB, of the lowest price. And in those days, the arbitrage, the opportunity to find lowest prices in other countries was practical and was possible. And for various reasons, that's not true anymore. And also, the level of responsibility and the way in which we have to now integrate our relationship with our vendors means that we can no longer do that. Now, I tell the story that, when I worked in the UK, I used to work in the factory. And our head of sales used to come in and say, Colin, can you get these goods and get them on a truck and get them delivered to Bond Street tomorrow? We've got sales. We want them to sell on Saturday. Get them on. And in those days, we didn't have this large supply chain kind of network that sat between the vendor and sat between the consumer. And today we have these huge ERP systems. We have these large container shipping. We have these large containers that are shipped in these giant container ships. We then sit and ship it halfway across the world with all the implications of that. And we then end up storing 90 days worth of inventory in a large warehouse in the US or wherever before we then deliver it to individual consumers. That doesn't make a lot of sense if you really think about it logically. I challenge you whether too many of you have 90 days worth of breakfast cereal in your cupboards at home. That's not the way we work. And the cost now of sustaining this lower price model of chasing cheap labor, it doesn't work anymore. we have a responsibility to the workers in the factories, and we've also got this huge cost that we kind of built to service this model that's no longer practical. And we're really seeing this kind of shift, and the fact that we're having to think much more creatively about our supply chain resiliency is pushing us to get ever closer to the consumer, and it's causing us to rethink how we're balancing our supply chains. Now, and a large part of that is the e-commerce, and we've seen one of the things that we've seen. E-commerce has always been important, but we're really seeing a really drive towards e-commerce. So when I think about some of the things that are different, one of the big things that is different is just the amount of online shopping. Many brands have seen a huge increase in the number of customers that are shopping online, and that's having a huge impact on our warehouses, on our distribution centers, and how we think about managing that part of our business. We're also finding that we also sense that the workplace is changing. The way in which we think about work is going to be very different. We have a lot of people now saying that they're far more efficient working from home. We're now starting to think about, what does that mean for our office space? What does that mean for the way in which we hold meetings? What does that mean for the protocols and processes through which we kind of run our business? In many respects, we're finding it's changing the way we treat each other, actually, on these virtual meetings. We actually, in many respects, are much more collaborative on these Zoom kind of meetings, because we actually do go around and ask people to speak and ask their opinions. So because you can only have a one-way conversation, it seems to be a much more democratic way of managing meetings. I think that's going to change things as well. And leaning on from that, technology and the fact that we can actually do this is such a big shift. And, if this crisis would have happened 20 years ago, we would have been in a very different world of hurt. These days, we can all communicate to each other virtually. And so our ability to think about how we continue to ramp up technology is something that I think is going to be different as well. From a supply chain perspective, we're also seeing the way in which we build digital and virtual samples and digital and virtual products and sell in of a much more digital kind of model is a big change, and will be very different than the old supply chain. Those days where it necessarily took us 12 months to develop a product is no longer practical, and it's no longer necessary because we can do so much of it virtually. So I think that will continue to accelerate. One of the other things that we're seeing as a sports brand is the shift in the way in which people are exercising and working out. Team sports is pretty much dead at this moment in time, but people are working out much more at home. So we're finding the way in which sales kind of evolve is very different. And it's something which we're trying to understand from the point of view of how people are exercising and what that kind of means. And I think for the sports business, I think that's okay. For the fashion business, that's a little bit more difficult because, we're not all thinking about what we're going to wear when we go into the office tomorrow. We're now thinking about what am I going to wear when I work out. So it's a little bit different. I think that will change things and how we think. And to Steve's point, the health and wellness and what that means for our oversight for sustainability is also going to be a huge unlock. Steve talked very articulately about that. And I do think, increasingly one of the things that is going to be different, and it's been, it's a theme that's been growing for a long time and something that we have to take seriously, is the responsibility we have, not just for our supply chain, but for, the societies and the communities in which we live. And the George Floyd tragedy is kind of one part of that and something that we're all trying to deal with. But also thinking about what that means for our supply chains as well, thinking about what that means for the workers in our supply chains. They're the most vulnerable people within our supply chains, and trying to make sure that, we do no evil as we're kind of building our product and thinking about how do we operate on a global platform. So it's a really interesting time, and and I do genuinely believe that the key to running these kind of businesses in these troubled times is having a resilient supply chain.
Well, thank you both. That was terrific, and you've opened up a number of doors that I think I wanted to walk through. I couldn't resist thinking that, Colin, as you were talking, that while we may not have a 90-day inventory in your line of products, or a 90-day inventory in breakfast cereal, but we seem to have a 90-day inventory in toilet paper.
Yes, we do.
So there's no figuring out the irrationality, if that's the right word, of the American consumer. But let me work my way down several different themes that you've touched on and see if I can get some additional comments from both of you. The first is sort of at the retail. Let's start at the front end, I guess, or the back end, depends on how you look at it. I guess the front end, the retail issue and the brick and mortar issue. And I think you both commented, particularly Colin, on the transition that was going on anyway toward online shopping.
Right.
And I can speak from personal experience. My wife orders everything now. Probably hasn't been in a department store in a long time. And of course, these days, nobody's going to a store because they can't for one reason or another. What's going to happen? Where are we going to be 6 months from now? Are the stores coming back or not?
No, I think there will always be a need for bricks and mortar, and that's not going to go away. One of the challenges we have with this remote working and this kind of remote living is that we do ultimately miss that personal kind of connectivity. And that personal connectivity is not just in the way that we're kind of interacting with each other, but also in the way we interact with brands, and we interact with product. I was on a call with, not to name drop, with Malcolm Gladwell the other day, and he was kind of saying it's a bit like food without spice. There's not a great deal of joy to it. Sometimes it's a fairly soulless experience just sitting and buying things online. So I think there will always be a need for bricks and mortar. The US does have perhaps the greatest concentration of shopping in the world. The mall space is out of kilter with the rest of the world. So I think we will continue to see some reduction in compression of bricks and mortar. But I think you will see stores will still be a really important part of our business, just because it's the way in which people can advertise, and not just advertise, but the way in which you can really experience the brand and understand what the brand is about and the business is about. You don't get the same experience from just shopping online. Maybe if you're going to buy toilet paper, that may be okay. But if you want to go and feel what the next amazing athletic shoe is going to be like, you kind of have to go to the store and try it on.
Well, yeah, if you want to try it on, I think that would be an issue. Steve, let me pursue that and pick up on it, the sustainability point that you made. Can you talk a little bit about what is recovery really going to mean for your industry? Do you expect to return to the same levels of sales and revenue that you had, say, last year? Or do you think permanently people are just going to be buying less clothing and fewer shoes?
It's really hard to say at this point. I think, once you try to predict anything out further than 4 or 5 months, you're really in uncharted territory. These are just some of the themes that people are talking about is, how much they buy, what kind of fashions they buy, what the stores will look like. To Colin's point, I think brick and mortar is going to be around, but, will companies try to learn the lesson that said, if you were selling food and selling other kinds of essential products, quote unquote essential products, you were allowed to stay open. And so to insulate yourself from that in any future pandemic, do you start to create a line of those kinds of products? Or companies that are in malls, retailers that are in malls may find that their reopen timetable is slower than if they're standalone, right? If they have the ability to do that curbside service. So people are learning lessons, not only as they were going into it from a supply chain perspective, but as they're coming out of it. I think that to that point about sustainability, you are going to see folks trying to manage their supply chain so they're not holding onto that 90 days of inventory, so they can react and pivot a lot quicker. Look at what we had going on in China, and then what we've got going on in Europe and the United States is you've got these inventories that were put in stores, and then the stores were shut for a couple of months. So then you're no longer selling those products. And then by the time the stores are opening up, now you're selling products that need a different level of inventory coming in. So now you've got to bring old product out, move new product in. If you've got a more nimble inventory base, a more nimble supply chain, that's not so much of a problem.
So just to allow me interject at that point too, I can't resist commenting for our listeners. You made an important point, Steve, in your initial remark about the tariffs, and I just can't resist emphasizing, your guys are paying the tariffs, right? The Chinese are not paying the tariffs.
Yeah. You're right. It's a point that always needs to be reinforced, and I probably should have said it before, is that the tariffs are paid by the importer of record, the companies in the United States. And then sometimes, that tariff is passed along to the end consumer. And in fact, most of the tariffs that we were paying 2 to 3 years ago those tariffs are already baked into prices. It's already baked into the underlying prices because we've been paying those tariffs at those levels for, since 1930, since they were imposed.
Let's turn now to something that both of you alluded to, which is the employment in the industry. And obviously, when things shut down the way they have, one of the other things that happens is that employees get laid off or furloughed. I mean, maybe you can comment on what the trend has been in your industry, whether it's just been to, to fire lots of people or to furlough them, or whether you're continuing to pay them. Different companies have followed different models, but one of the things that we've been looking at CSIS is how people then are going to go back to work. Our smaller companies, are they going to reopen at all, and are they going to fold? The bigger companies, I would put Under Armour in that category, as a bigger company. Are you going to see this as an opportunity to restructure and reduce your labor force and do things differently than you have been before, or do you see employment growing back close to where it was to the same extent that sales grows back to where it was, or is there going to be some permanent change in the nature of your labor force?
I mean, I'm not sure I necessarily want to get into exactly what we're doing with our strategic plan with regards to our workforce, but yeah, we are, as we open stores, we are bringing people back. Obviously we furloughed, the majority of our retail staff and many of our distribution centers, but now our distribution centers are up and running pretty much at full capacity again. And as we open stores, we're bringing our employees back into the stores because, we do run, we believe, a relatively kind of efficient model, and we know how many people we need in each store to kind of manage the consumers. Now, obviously, that's a little different when you only allow, when states have different rules with regards to how many consumers can be in a store at each time. So, we're working our way through that. But to your point, are we going to be doing things differently as we come out of this model? Of course, yeah. We've spent quite a bit of time really thinking through what we've learned and what we should what has been the value in going through this experience and what we've gained from that. And that old expression, never let a good crisis go to waste. We have been spending time thinking through about how do we make Under Armour a different place to work and concretize some of the learnings that we've had as we've gone through this. So yeah, I think we will see. I do think to Steve's point earlier, I think it'll be a little different whether you're a department store or whether you're a standalone kind of store or whether you're a brand store in a mall or so I think there'll be slightly different models and different parts of the business will play out different ways. I don't think it's such a broad brush approach that you can kind of say it'll just be, there'll be 20% less people in this, 20% less staff in the store. I think it'll be very much dependent upon what industry you're in and what operating model you decide to kind of run.
Steve, can you add that? But Steve, also talk a little bit too about it from the perspective of this is a global problem. So talk about it from the point of view of the manufacturers, the people that are actually making your products, and how their workforce is going to be affected.
Well,
Steve? I'm sorry.
Please.
Well, yeah. So I mean, let's start with what happened is that you had stores closing down for 2 to 3 months, depending upon where you were, and stores are not designed to operate for a long time in that model. I mean, they need revenue coming in the front door so that can generate cash to pay the bills, to pay the employees, to pay the rent, and then to also start to buy the product, and that product then makes its way through the supply chains, which stretch through the United States, these incredible global value chains, and into all parts of the world. As I said, when I mentioned a global industry. As we were going into this, one of the things that we were asking the government to do was to provide tariff relief, because we wanted to use those funds to keep people employed. We had a number of members making the point, some of them on TV, that we can either pay the tariff bill or we can pay the payroll, and we just want the government to tell us what to do. And the administration did provide some tariff deferral relief. It was limited for a couple of months. We've actually asked for it to be extended for another couple of months because certainly the crisis hasn't passed, and we can still rely on that liquidity. We need that liquidity really everywhere, every which way we can get it. And as you can inject more of that liquidity into the system, you then enable these companies, which are job creators. I mean, if you look at retail writ large, 1 in 4 U.S. jobs is created by retail, right? So if you keep these companies around, the big ones and the small ones, and keep them healthy and keep them solvent, so that as the economy opens back up again, they're in a position where they can start to hire more people. You now look at what's going on around the world, and you've got these supply chains and factories all over the world that have they've also had to close because the revenue and the orders aren't making their way down the supply chain. A lot of Americans, maybe a lot of trade policy practitioners, think that imports just arrive at the border, and all of a sudden, we have to do something with these imports. An import arrives at the border. It was planned for, 9 months, a year earlier. A whole army of people in the United States, designers, compliance individuals, you name it, got together and decided, we're gonna produce a product that resulted in orders and production around the world, which then results in product that's distributed and ultimately sold to the U.S. consumer. As the money stops at the front end, that whole system grinds to a halt. And what we're trying to do right now, just to really make it simple, is start that system back up again. So, Colin, I don't know if you want to add on to that or.
No, I think you put it well, Steve. When you throw there's a reason why it's a supply chain. It's an integrated kind of process, and and actually, the value chain and the cogs in that now are pretty tight. There's not a lot of room for flexibility in that because we're all trying to run increasingly kind of efficient models, and you throw a cog in that, you throw the wrench in that clock, and everything kind of grinds to a halt. And that's kind of the impact that's been having on many of the vendors. And, it's one of the challenges that we and many in our industry have been dealing with is our demand to slow down. How can we make sure that we're continuing to support those vendors? Because they're an incredibly important part of our overall supply chain. So how can we continue to support those guys and make sure that they can remain solvent and viable and ensure that the workers continue to get paid all the way through the process? And so, it's been a challenging time. But to Steve's point, I think the key now is how do we kind of how do we restart the kind of process? How do we kickstart it? How do we make sure that we can continue to kind of flow through it?
Well, on that, Steve, you mentioned the government providing tariff relief, albeit temporary relief. Are there other things that the government could do to help you guys get back on your feet?
Well, I think when you look at sort of the larger COVID relief programs, we've been asking that those programs, whether it's the Paycheck Protection Program, the Main Street Lending, new backstops for credit risk insurance, that they be made or enable the industry to take advantage of them more. There's a lot of programs that have been created, but in many cases, the companies can't take advantage of them because they don't meet all the criteria. They meet 4 out of the 5 criteria, but they don't meet that 5th one. Therefore, they can't take advantage of any of it at all. The tariff relief was a great example where, the administration was trying to draw a distinction between the normal tariffs and then the penalty tariffs, the trade remedy tariffs like Section 301. We didn't agree with that decision, but that was their decision. Then when they rolled it out, there wasn't enough time for companies to go through the very tedious process of separating out their entries so they could segregate the penalty tariffs from the non-penalty tariffs. So a lot of deferral couldn't happen. So in addition to trying to get that program extended, now that mechanism has been created and the infrastructure is in place, we've actually asked for other tariff relief. Hard as it is to seem, we still charge tariffs on face masks. We still charge Section 301 tariffs on isolation gowns. We think it's long past time for these kinds of penalties and barriers to be removed. So, we don't create costs that stand in the way of the work that we're trying to do here.
One of the issues that is particularly appropriate for your industry, because you're well situated, is manufacturing, or I guess producing personal protective equipment, masks, and things like that. I assume that you are particularly well situated to do that. Talk a little bit about how your industry has responded to that, the sudden spike in demand for those products, and what were the main challenges that you faced in trying to meet it?
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead. After you, Steve. Please,
Okay.
Steve.
So this is what I call kind of our Rosie the Riveter moment, is that, companies really had to pivot. I mean, this is not an industry that many of our members have really been producing for. Some of them were, and they're already there, but many of them weren't. And so it was recalibrating, reimagining, repurposing their supply chains, repurposing their factories, starting to learn how to make a different kind of a product. Particularly if you're making, whether it's masks or gloves, the hats, the gowns, whatever it might be. Now you're starting to talk about if it's coming from offshore, in addition to customs requirements. Now you're also talking about FDA, Food and Drug Administration requirements. And those requirements were constantly changing and being recalibrated. And I would say in a good way by the FDA, because one of the things they tried to do is they recognized that a whole lot of companies were now coming into the space. So how could they take a process which sometimes takes 90 days, 180 days, even longer to get approval? How could they compress that so they could get as many suppliers and as many of their suppliers qualified as quickly as possible to meet the crushing need? Going forward, there's going to be another discussion about how much should this supply chain be permanently relocated to the United States? Should we, in an effort to reduce our dependence on supply chains that are in other countries, should this be an entirely a US-based supply chain? And a number of people are talking about that. Or should it be something that threads through Central America or Mexico, or something that just enables us to be as responsive as we can? And I think the jury's still out on kind of where the answer is going to come down on that. Part of that will depend a little bit on what the federal government decides to do. Are they just going to buy to replenish their stocks now, or are they going to be looking at this as sort of an ongoing demand? And that's a question that I think a discussion we'll be having over the next couple of months.
Colin?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in as well. I mean, we pivoted pretty quickly to making face masks. We obviously have Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore. So we partnered. In fact, we immediately got on the phone to our friends over at Johns Hopkins, which we obviously do a lot of work with already, and we stood up pretty quickly a face manufacturing kind of plant. We actually have something here in Baltimore called the Lighthouse, which is kind of our advanced innovation kind of center, and we have some relatively high tech cutting equipment here, which allows us to cut and fold, which we designed, and a mask that we could cut and fold relatively quickly. And I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think we'll have made about 6 million face masks just in that plant alone by early June time, so about now. We've been supplying a lot of masks to the hospitals in Maryland and in the Washington area. So we've been leaning into that pretty aggressively, and that's something that's worked really well. One of the other things we've done, and we've worked across the industry to share that model globally. So we've actually, because the cutting equipment we have can work for any of our vendors, because many of our vendors have similar cutting equipment, and many of our competitors have it. We made that open sourced and made that open thought and allowed that to be kind of utilized by whoever in the industry wanted to use it, because it was a pretty innovative mask that really didn't require a great deal of manufacturing. And that it's not an N95, it's not a mask that you're going to wear in a operating theater, but from the point of view of a protection mask when you go into the hospital, it worked well. So we pivoted towards that. We also then pivoted with a lot of our more US-based manufacturing and even Latin American-based manufacturing to start making gowns. So we worked again with some of our competitors in the industry to acquire material from our competitors who had similar kind of operating models, and they were challenged with capacity to produce those gowns as well. So we have an industry have kind of really rallied around this to try and make sure that we've been able to kind of help support our communities as we've gone through that. But it's not something, I mean, Under Armour, we will be selling a commercial mask going forward just because it's the commercial thing to do. But we won't be becoming a mask company. It's not kind of what we do.
Does the technology that you are talking about to make the masks, does that have later on a kind of a spillover effect? Can you apply it to your more traditional products as well and change your supply chains that way?
Well, I mean, we're using that model already in our supply chains, which is kind of why we've got one of the reasons we have the equipment in our facilities here in Baltimore. I mean, but the question still, and Steve kind of alluded to it earlier, is, is manufacturing going to return to the US for footwear and apparel? And I don't think that can realistically happen, just because the level of complexity that's involved, which is always underestimated by people that don't necessarily work in the industry. It's going to be really difficult to actually start manufacturing things, because the automation isn't there to be able to make it in a location where labor rates are much, much higher. And where there just isn't that amount of pool of labor to be able to manufacture these kind of goods. There's just not enough people. It's not uncommon for a small factory in Asia to have 5,000 workers. And that small factory in Asia with 5,000 workers will be making 500,000 pairs of let's talk about shoes, 500,000 pairs of shoes a month. And that's a relatively small facility. That's not particularly big. So even if you increased your efficiency by 3 times, so all of a sudden you could actually, you no longer needed 5,000 workers to make 500,000 units. You only needed, let's pick a number, 2,000 workers to make the same thing. You still need 2,000 workers to make, and we just don't have that interest and that kind of opportunity to kind of build that industry here. But I do think nearshoring is going to become more important. So the opportunity of kind of moving production back nearer to the locations where we'll be selling product, but then working with the industry in the countries where we're looking to sell product. And so looking at the material suppliers, the fabric suppliers, in the US, we have an amazing cotton industry. So working with that industry to help think about how that can help facilitate it, as opposed to necessarily thinking about how we can cut and sew garments in the US. But a lot of people neglect to remember, or forget to remember, is actually one of the biggest challenges, not actually where you cut and sew the materials, it's actually all the other suppliers that go with it. It's the mills, it's the knitting machines, it's the trims, it's the boxes, it's all the other equipment that has to come with it. We could probably start stitching here in the US, but I'd still have to import all the materials from offshore anyway. So it's how do we build that infrastructure? And that infrastructure often exists more in kind of in Asia and perhaps in Latin America.
Steve, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. Talk a little bit about the trends and regionalization trends in the industry, and talk a little bit about nearshoring as opposed to things coming back to the United States. I mean, the president wants jobs to come back to the United States. Colin has talked about the unlikelihood of a lot of that happening in this industry. But talk about that from your perspective, nearshoring. Who's the winner here? Is it Mexico? Is it somebody else? Are jobs coming back here?
Well, one of the things that we see as a result of kind of really all the trends is that there's an opportunity for Central America, Dominican Republic, perhaps Mexico. Although Mexico, I'd say, does have an advantage in the newly negotiated USMCA, not so much because it's anything new or different, but because by negotiating the USMCA, it kind of puts that sort of laser focus on NAFTA away. So maybe that's kind of a relative area of stability and security where you don't expect to see too many more trade policy disruptions in the near term. And that's certainly what a lot of folks have been looking at. And one of the reasons why we were so appreciative when that got completed, because we sort of felt that we were going to be able to kind of take that off the table, as it were. I think in Central America, there's long been a frustration. We're about to hit the 15th anniversary of CAFTA being voted on in the House and the Senate, and there's long been a frustration that we haven't seen more business come out of Central America as a result of CAFTA. In Central America, you have to use U.S. yarns, U.S. fabrics, or regional fabrics and yarns if you want to use the agreement. And we long hear about folks complaining that there isn't enough materials to satisfy those very restrictive rules of origin. So is there an opportunity for flexibility there? Or is there an opportunity for folks to come up with different models that will then use the fact that Central America is so close to the U.S. market as the competitive advantage? So their competitive advantage wouldn't be duty-free, but would rather be they're close to the U.S. That's the thing. And they can do that, and they can develop that as long as all of the customs procedures, as long as the trade policies in Central America they need to go through that pivot to make sure that works so they can be reliable, quick, fast, efficient partners. Otherwise, all those needs the industry are going to have, they're not going to find them met through Central America. I've been at the association for 22 years, and for 22 years, I keep getting the question, when is manufacturing going to come back to the United States? And I would always argue that that's the wrong question. Anything that left the United States is not coming back. What does occur in the United States is what I call new shoring. So this is production that is following a different model. So if it left the United States, more than likely there was some competitive situation that didn't anchor it here. But what's going to be starting in the U.S. and what will continue to happen, although at a very slow but I think steady rate, is production that is built around new technologies, maybe production that's built around new relationships that have been created in the last 90 days as companies have learned about other companies that exist in the supply chain that they didn't know. As the rush to make masks, I didn't know that guy made elastics. I didn't know that person made that kind of a nose clip. I didn't know that person made that other material. Maybe we can do some other products together in the future. And so I think there's going to be some opportunities on that. We've actually been charting a slow, gradual increase in made in USA for about 12 years for both apparel and for footwear. But it's very slow and it's very small. And when we ask people what's behind it, they tell us it's not patriotism, it's not any of these other things. It's speed to market. It's being close to the consumer and being able to satisfy e-commerce. So to the extent that this small industry can grow with the right technologies and be positioned to satisfy those needs, then I think that's where the business model is going to be. It won't be trade related.
Agreed.
Very interesting, particularly that last point, which I did not know. We've got several questions from our listeners, but one more let me ask one more of Steve. No discussion about trade is complete without the word China. So I need to ask a question about China. And I'll put it this way. Are you guys all leaving? And if so, where are they going?
Well, this was the point I was kind of making before. They're kind of both leaving and staying at the same time. China is one of the fastest growing, largest consumer markets. So if you are a global fashion company, global apparel, global footwear, and you're not selling into China, you're missing a huge opportunity. So retail in China is important, and a lot of companies are using sort of that local for local model. But when it comes to using China as a source of production to ship to the United States and perhaps increasingly to ship to Europe, then you're starting to see companies diversify out of China. And if you look at the numbers just in the last 3 months compared to the first 3 months of January through March of 2019, we saw 30% drops in apparel, footwear, and travel goods. And that reflects a bunch of things. It reflects lower shipments overall, but it also reflects, the continuation of people reacting to the trade war and people trying to produce product in other places because they couldn't produce it because of COVID. Either they couldn't produce it because the Chinese factories that were making the end product were closed for a number of weeks and months, or because the factories in other parts of Asia that were relying on that material coming from China, they would then close down because they couldn't get the materials. And then eventually they would close down because there wasn't enough demand coming from the US or Europe. So the short answer is, if you're making in China for China, you're staying. If you're making in China for other parts of the world, you're diversifying, and a lot of that is beginning to move out or continuing to move out.
To where? Vietnam? Somewhere else?
Everywhere. I mean, it's just the first choice seems to be Vietnam, except Vietnam's full. So then it's Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, a lot of other countries, and maybe eventually Central America, as I mentioned before. I think there's an opportunity for them to grab more business. Not grabbing China business, they're growing kind of a different model, but eventually you may see companies place some of that business there.
Yeah, I just echo that. I kind of talk of Vietnam as being the stepping stone. It's kind of the first step outside of China. So much of global supply chains existed in China, and it was an easy shift to move to Vietnam. But But Vietnam is not a long-term solution. It's okay. It's fine. It's doing a great job. But we can't sit on our haunches nor sit in Vietnam. So it is going everywhere. The days of having a one country that dominates that level of supply, it won't happen again. It is going to go everywhere, partly because of the nearshoring that Steve spoke about. So it's going to be a little bit of product everywhere. But the difference is that it won't be new factories in every single place you go. You'll tend to go to these new locations with existing partners that have a global footprint, as opposed to necessarily going to a mom-and-pop shop in, I don't know, Mumbai or somewhere. You'll tend to go there with somebody who has a global footprint and who can actually help coordinate and choreograph your business globally.
Okay, we have some questions from our listeners. We also, I should say, had a couple comments from our listeners who didn't follow the rules and ask a question. And so I'm not going to make the comments, but I am going to ask the questions. The first one for you is from Juan, which is, there was an interesting article in the New York Times today about the future of fashion and what will draw people back to retail. Do either of you want to comment on that?
I've got the article to read. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but as I said, we are a social species. We're a very fashionable species, and so I think consumers will continue to look at fashion. They'll look at their need to be with other people, to show off product that's affordable, that showcases them, that meets their needs, and that will continue. It's been around forever, and it will continue to be around. So anyone that looks at fashion dying as a result of this is sadly mistaken.
Okay, next question is this. I think we've sort of touched on this before, but I'm going to ask it anyway. This is from Annie. How is the apparel industry being affected given the current relations with China and the trade war?
Well, I think the apparel industry, as I said, it's really about diversification. I mean, one of the sort of the short-term problems is that as you get tariffs imposed on you for product coming out of China, that is, you don't have the ability to pivot too quickly, as quickly as you would like. And so you end up having to pay those tariffs. As we talked about before, it's the apparel importers that are paying those tariffs. About 40% of our apparel in 2019 that we imported came from China, and about 90% of that apparel had a tariff imposed on it under that tranche 4A, that initially 15% and then 7.5%. So when we talked about how the Section 301 tariffs weren't going to affect consumer goods, they affected 90% of all the apparel that we import from China in that tranche. And of course, that's on top of 50% of the footwear, 65% or so of the home textiles, things like blankets and sheets, and then 100% of backpacks, handbags, things like that. So while the industry is in China, it is very susceptible to any of these tariffs or any of these other trade actions that may occur.
Colin, you want to add anything, or?
No, I think Steve kind of summed it up. I think part of my job and the job of those guys who run sourcing, supply chains, or operations is to mitigate risk. And we all feel we're all very nervous about the trade relations at the moment and how that plays out. And so we're spending our time trying to mitigate that risk and trying not to be solely reliant on one individual country. We became a little drunk on China for a while there, but I think we've certainly from an Under Armour perspective, we've kind of mitigated a lot of that. And I think the industry has been moving that way for a while. But it's difficult because one of the things that China has, it has all the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And, as I alluded to earlier, one of the challenges with nearshoring or even bringing stuff back into the US is the fact that you don't have those tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. Many of those tier 2, tier 3 suppliers all existed in China. So you can kind of work the model in China. That's much more difficult when your supply chain becomes much more fragmented. But the industry has been working through this for a while now, and I think we're all reducing our exposure in that country.
Let me. I've got another one, but let me pick up on that for a minute because it relates to something that we've been talking about at CSIS. If you're going to build diversification, if that's the right word, into your supply chains in some ways that you haven't before, doesn't that inevitably mean you're going to come up with less optimal outcomes? You're going to go in a direction that's more expensive, and does that flow back to consumers?
It is a concern. I mean, it's it's one of the things that, in fact, we've been chatting about recently is the fact if you think about how do you protect yourself from these type of shocks in the future, you do need to kind of, number one, you need to have diversity. So that means potentially you have less leverage in the way in which you're operating. You also need to make, paradoxically, it may actually force you to think very differently about how you manage inventory and other things as well. So yeah, it's. I think we're also seeing the number of our suppliers, and I think we're fortunate, but I think our suppliers are also understanding that they need to think differently about their relationships with some of the businesses as well. And the days in which perhaps you just had an open trust relationship with your supplier, some businesses are starting to disappear. People are wanting LCs and other things in place, which puts additional barriers, but gives you some protection from these kind of shocks. So yeah, I think potentially you are seeing increases. It could be increases in costs. Now, I think we'll also see that this crisis will allow us to find other opportunities to drive leverage. So I don't think it will necessarily be an automatic pass through, because we'll be moving to places where the tariffs are less. So I think the numbers will work out in the end. But yeah, it's going to put pressure on supply chains for a while.
Okay, we've got two more questions, which will take us right to the end of the time, I think. This one is from Nathan, and it relates to something that one of you said earlier. The virus has exposed how precariously many service industry workers live, whether in pay or medical benefits. Are companies doing anything to rethink their responsibility to their lowest paid workers?
I think people are trying to understand that. I think I know we are all kind of trying to think through how do we address some of these issues, and just to build on one of the thing that's playing out today, the George Floyd situation that's in the tragedy that we're seeing play out there means that we do have to think about our responsibility for the society we live in, for the communities where we sell our products, and the individuals that work in our factories. And I think it's something we're all trying to think through, and all trying to work through what's the best way of moving that forward. And I don't have a good solution for that yet, but I think it's a challenge that we're all trying to understand.
Yeah, and I would just jump on that. The taking care of your workers is really part and parcel of being sustainable. You can't have a sustainable operation unless you are doing what is the right thing and what is necessary to make sure that those workers are well compensated, have the wherewithal that they are able to provide for their families, that there is the proper communal support that goes into this as well. And you're right. And every time you come to a challenge like this, you realize, geez, we thought we were doing better than we were.
Right.
And so we're going to go, going forward, we're going to do better. And this is really the kind of the mantra of corporate social responsibility for the last 25 years, as long as I've been working on it, is, every day you're doing better than the day before, and tomorrow you're going to do better than what you're doing today. What are the specific things that are going to come out of this? I can't say, but I can only guarantee you that they will come out and things will be better.
Okay, last question, and I think this is primarily for Steve, although Colin, you can comment as well, because it picks up on something that Steve said. This is from Lowell. What specific changes in sustainability are being implemented because of COVID-19?
Because of COVID-19, I don't know yet. I think it's probably too early to kind of learn that lesson. I think one of the things that we are realizing as a result of COVID-19 is some of the traditional supplier relationships that had been built up have been subjected to a shock. As companies have not seen revenue come in, and then that's really stressed a lot of these downstream supplier relationships. So companies have been asking for their suppliers and their suppliers to undertake a number of commitments. So those companies to undertake commitments, and then if they weren't able to pay, or they're not able to continue their orders along, then what does that say about the partnership? And so I think one of the things that kind of gets to the point that Colin did is do we have to rebuild the trust relationship to make sure that as we're doing things together on sustainability, that can then go forward in a better situation. And this is certainly one of the things that we've been hearing a lot of folks talk about is, we don't want COVID to have set back any of the sustainability efforts. In fact, we want to make sure that as we go forward, that we see a little bit more of what we call a green recovery. That people can start to institute things, and maybe that'll be, if supply chains are closer to home, if the purchasing is done on a quicker basis, that in alone will be 2 steps that make it more sustainable. But specifically, it's hard to say at this point.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just echo that by saying that, and I referenced this earlier, but the days of us being marauding garmentos has gone. We can't kind of run from one factory to another factory chasing the lowest possible price. We can only build this business, with symbiotic relationships with suppliers, and they have to be built on trust. They have to be built on mutual respect, and they have to be built in a way that kind of protects all of the actors that we have across the supply chain. And that's I think this crisis is going to accelerate that and force us to continue to build that level of trust and those level of relationships.
Agreed.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Thank you both for something that was very, very enlightening, thought-provoking. I learned a lot, which I always like to do. It will probably show up in future columns that I'm doing. And for our listeners, we intend to do this some more with other sectors. I think the next one will be the automotive sector, and we'll let you all know what date and time we have in mind for that once it's fully scheduled. But meantime, to Steve and Colin, thank you very much for your time. And to the rest of you, thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.